Welcome to Field Talk, a Monitor Farm Scotland podcast. Join our host, Wallace Curry, as he explores the stories from Monitor Farm networks on how farmers have adapted their businesses with support from specialists and experts to assess farm performance and explore opportunities. Monitor Farm Scotland is farmer-led, farmer-driven, encouraging discussion and solution-based thinking.
Welcome back everyone to Field Talk, the Monitor Farm Scotland podcast. Every time in this series we're more looking at the sort of projects that are happening as opposed to speaking to the actual Monitor Farm farmers. Monitor farmers? You know what I mean anyway. And we're looking at various things that have been happening throughout the project. And today we're going to be looking at selecting for the future using genetics and genomics for replacement suitability and lifetime profitability. We're going to have two people on the call today who've been actively involved in this project, and we'll introduce them as we go. The first person is Lauren Porteus, who works at Zoetis, and the second person is Chris Barclay, who works for the Stabiliser Cattle Company. Lauren and Chris, would you like to say hello?
Hi.
How's it going?
It's going very well. How are yourselves? You well?
Loving the sunshine. I think everyone is, aren't they?
Have you got the same, Chris? Have you got the weather out there?
Indeed, beautiful weather up here in Aberdeenshire.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, I almost had to come back inside because it was too warm earlier, and that's that's a stretch in Scotland. That is, but here we are. We're not gonna say no. And have I said that right there, Lauren? It's Zoetis, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, Zoetis, depends where you are regionally, but yeah, we'll take that.
I just wanted to make sure because it's a word I've said for some time, but I've never actually fully fact checked it, so I thought I'd just make sure. But just for the listeners, guys, it's always quite good when we kick off these episodes just to give a bit of background to someone. It always makes it a bit easier if you know who you're listening to and have a bit of idea who they are. So purely, Chris, because you're first on my screen, could we just have a wee bit of background as to who Chris Barclay is?
Yes, I spent 40 years in the livestock feed industry, and while I was working in that industry, I came across the Stabiliser Cattle Company almost exactly 25 years ago, and immediately thought, oh, this is a very, very interesting project, and visited the Stabiliser Nucleus farm down in Yorkshire in 2001, and took a couple of farmers from Aberdeenshire with me, and really followed ever since then. I officially retired from my feed job 3.5 years ago, and the Stabiliser Cattle Company were looking for a representative in Scotland, so I jumped at it, my dream job.
Excellent, good news, and it's an interesting part of that, and I'm just going to ask because I know I'll forget if I don't. How do the nucleus farms work? How are you chosen? How does that sort of come up?
Well, the farm I was referring to is Givendale in Yorkshire, which is part of the JSR Farms group, and they were the first people to take in stabiliser embryos in the UK, as far as I'm aware. But we now have in Scotland 15 what we call multiplier farms, which are basically stabiliser pedigree breeders who do a vast amount of recording, and they're the only people allowed to sell pedigree stabiliser stock in Scotland, both females and males.
And what was it back in 2001 that really drew you? What made you jump away and think, stabilisers are what I want to pursue for the next 24 years?
A lot of issues in the suckler cow industry in terms of difficult calvings, people using very scopy continental bulls, and high labour inputs, high cost, very large females that needed an awful lot of forage to keep them through the winter.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's just, many reasons to jump over, absolutely. And Lauren, for yourself, just a bit of background to you. I believe away from the day job, you're also farming as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so my background is that I'm a vet. I was a farm vet in practice down here in Northumberland for about 5 years before I moved across into industry. And then I also farm with my husband. We've got about 250 Cheviot ewes in the North Pennines in Northumberland, so I kind of have both angles going on. And I came to Zoetis in 2023 and my role here is within the precision animal health team, so working mainly with our genomic technology in beef and dairy cows. So real interest, really new technology coming forward, and I've really enjoyed being part of this project because of my farm vet background. Would echo a lot of what Chris said in terms of that kind of change for his interest in the Stabiliser breed. I would have also experienced quite a lot of that coalface and calving difficulties, challenges with, you know, certain classic breeds where we can have a lot of problems and the impact on farm in terms of profitability and things like that. So I've taken a real interest in this angle and how we can look to try and solve some of those problems for farms.
Do you ever find yourself missing conventional practice?
Yeah, definitely sometimes. I think the practical side of things, ironically, I tend to miss it most in spring, which is when I would have been the most busy and run ragged and sleep deprived of the year. But when you're seeing all the lambs and calves out in the field, you kind of get a hankering for it. But no, really enjoying being part of this angle as well. And can't say I miss multiple calls in the middle of the night. So pros and cons.
Yeah, well, I can imagine missing that is not something that happens, because that's the one part of it. Apart from the fact I'm not very good with blood, but we don't need to talk about that. It can't be the easiest job in the world. But we're here to talk about a project in general, run through the Monitor Farm project. Do you guys want to just sort of, I guess, enlighten us as to what that project is? Well, Lauren, purely because you've hopped now to first on my screen again, we'll go with yourself.
Yeah, of course. So this project with Stock and Tree has been around genomic testing and heifer selection. So we have been starting last spring. We've tested heifers with our genomic test Inherit Select. And that's been supported by the Monitor Farm and Stabilisers as well, because they're a herd that's using quite a lot of Stabiliser genetics. And the view there has been really to look at adding in an additional level to Bruce's selection. So can we get more information and make some more informed choices by using the genomic data for those heifers? So we did the first batch last year, and then that's continued this year with the next batch of heifers being tested, and the kind of lessons applied from last year coming through to this year.
And this is a project that's happening elsewhere with the Monitor Farm. It's just this is also focused on the Banff and Buchan Monitor Farm as well. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So this is technology that we're using throughout the UK and globally as well, in terms of the test itself. But it was just a really nice opportunity to have a go and apply it on this farm within the Monitor Farm project, and support some meetings and things there to discuss that wider decision-making process.
And tell us, Chris, how has it been adapted for the Monitor Farm, or is it working somewhat similar to the other projects of its same ilk, I guess?
No, it hasn't been adapted really for the Monitor Farm. I mean, Stock and Tree is a farm I've known for very many years, probably 25 years. And it was a farm typical in that they had, I hate to use the word mishmash, but it's probably the best description of the type of suckler cows. They have maybe Heinz 57 might be another expression. But came to Stabilisers a few years ago by buying bulls from a local multiplier, and a number of their cows now are part-bred Stabiliser. And I saw it as soon as I was introduced to Inherit by Lauren, which is that about 2 years ago, Lauren, I think?
Yes, yeah, that's when we first introduced it to the UK.
I thought this is something I could bring to the Monitor Farm, and especially one with commercial stabilisers, where using Inherit Select, we could really increase the selection criteria quite considerably. Do you want me to say a little bit about the selection criteria before we went to Inherit?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Bruce Irvin's selection criteria was actually very correct. He was selecting on phenotype, so in other words, the heifer had to look right. We're also really keen for people to use the 3 T's, teats, toes and temperament to make sure those three are correct. So the feet are right, teats and others are correct as far as they can be in a maiden heifer, and also temperament is correct. Bruce then went a stage further. At my suggestion is that he was having all the heifers vet checked and pelvic measured, and I suppose by introducing inherit select we were then adding on a further selection criteria just to see where we were on the genomics of his heifers, which in fact has proven to be amazingly revealing.
The transition from purely looking at an animal to then looking at data and looking at it genotypically as opposed to phenotypically is, I don't want to say fear, but it's a big change, isn't it? You know, it's that sort of stockspersonship transitioning towards data, and it's quite a big jump. Was that an easy jump for Bruce and the team, Chris, or did that come with some challenges?
I think it came with a few challenges, but once it was sort of talked through, I think Bruce became very much on board very quickly. Once he understood what was required and the information he was going to receive. I think, to be honest, Bruce, like many farmers, when they first see the Zoetis spreadsheet that it produces, and I would include myself in this, it is a little bit daunting, and certainly, I mean, Lauren's been great at helping people interpret the data, because that's the crucial part of it.
Yeah.
Lauren,
and
tell
I
us
would
about...
just... Oh, sorry, Wallace.
I was literally just going to say, tell us about that spreadsheet you were talking about, which I assume is where you were going anyway.
Yeah, so I was just going to add two things there, really. So I think on that point of kind of fear and uncertainty of using kind of new technology, I think one of the things that's important here is I would say that the inherit results aren't then superseding everything that you're seeing as a stock person. So it's very much designed and also in this example being used as an add-on to that additional stuff. So the process going forward for Bruce has been that, you know, we still are looking for those type traits, we still are looking for those heifers to reach their target weight for bulling and things like that. And if they had a great result but weren't performing in that way and didn't meet that criteria, they wouldn't necessarily be suddenly deemed different, because we have to remember that we're looking at the genomic data and the genes combined with what actually comes out in the phenotype, which is obviously going to be partially environmental as well. So it's an additional step as opposed to a replacement step, and I think that's where it's important to remember that that stockman side is still really important, and we're not trying to replace that in the beef side with numbers. But where the numbers come in, I think Chris's point there in terms of getting support with the information is really important, and that's what happens with these results, and you know, with anyone testing and with this technology with us, is that they get that support. And there's a great guy over at Stabiliser and Due Southwell that does a lot of the genomic support as well. So that's really important. In terms of the data, I think it's a completely fair point. We get a huge amount of data available through this. There's over 20 different traits that are reported in the evaluation. But the other thing there in terms of making it easy to use is that we use what's called an index. So there's multiple different indexes available within the results, and they enable the traits to be essentially put into a combination and individual figures. So that's similar, the same thing on the Stabiliser side. If people are familiar with pounds profit, for example, which is a Stabiliser index used on seed stock, that's available on Inherit as well, alongside the Zoetis indexes. So it's can be quite overwhelming, but the aim of the game is really to work out what the priorities for that farm are, and in this case what Bruce's priorities are, and then which of those indexes and then the individual traits we need to look at. So particularly we find with store herds like Bruce's, if we're selling stores, things like maternal traits are very important. So those maternal indexes in terms of your cow-calf index and then your pounds weaning index from Stabiliser potentially are more important in those herds than, say, some of those carcass traits. So it's trying to take what is a standardized evaluation and then make it specific to what Bruce needs out of his stock in order to perform the best and suit his system. So if we just kind of sent out a spreadsheet and left you to it, yeah, 100%, it would be really overwhelming. But we're definitely trying to avoid that happening. And I think Chris as well would have that feedback from how you guys have used the data with Bruce in this example as well.
I just hope the index for docility, feet and udders is called toes, teats and temples. Favourite thing I've heard, I really have. What support is there, Lauren? Because like you say, if it was just thrown that spreadsheet, even the sort of number geeks amongst us, sometimes if you don't know what the numbers are, it can be a bit confusing. But is there? You've mentioned the indices there. Is there discussions with separate farms that maybe there's a more important index for them, or you can sort of create one, if you will, or is that not what happens?
Yeah, so we don't typically create the indexes, because where we have to be careful is that we need that balance across different genetics. And what we find is that there's two main things in that. One of them is that we have different traits that need optimums, so what we would call intermediate optimums. It's not always beneficial to have the extremes of one end on the other. So something like mature cow weight, for example, we don't want our cows to be massive and we don't want them to be tiny either, and there's an intermediate optimum there. So in terms of just putting in a custom index, for example, that's a bit of a challenge from that sense, which is where it's all handled within those set indices. And then the other point there is just the correlations between different genes as well. So we need to make sure that certain things that don't correlate together are balanced, and that's where the development of these indexes has come in to try and achieve that balance. So we try not to mess with the indexes themselves, but it's more about working out which one is the most appropriate for the farm, and then outside of that, where we have strengths and weaknesses, and where that then informs different things. So if we work out priorities, for example, and what's going to suit best, do we then highlight an area where there is a particular weakness? And when it comes to things like bull buying, Chris will be able to comment on this as well. Are there areas that we can look at, because Stabiliser have genomically tested bulls? We can then say, right, actually, what kind of bull does Bruce need to look at in the future when it next comes to buying, because this is where his females are weaker. So it's adding that kind of additional layer onto both the heifer selection, but also you have that potential for the next step in the bulls too.
Could you tell us a bit about that, Chris, on the bull side of things?
Lauren's already touched on a member of our team, Andrew Southwell, who has a master's degree in genomics, and he is brilliant. If I give him a selection of bulls that are available to a farm, he is brilliant at matching up that with the females, especially for a commercial farmer, so he can suggest which is the correct bull, depending on whether the farmer is looking for higher finisher traits or higher weaning traits, so in other words, higher maternal traits. And my feeling all along with the Stabiliser project, if you like, and helped vastly by Inherit Select, is that it's really all about the cow. If a farmer can get his herd of cows correct and performing correctly, he's just about won the battle. And I think far too much emphasis in the past has been put on what type of or what breed of terminals sire should we use to produce huge great calves, instead of thinking the other way round, what breed of sire can we produce to get our suckler herd performing correctly.
Yeah, it's a good point, isn't it? I mean, I think we we look at the bull and we think that is the be all and end all. Now we obviously know it's not, but it is somewhat of an image. From an operational perspective, you know, you've made the decision, both looking at the animals and sort of running the data as well. From a day-to-day perspective, not at bull in time, is there much changes to the management of the farm, or are things pretty much the same after that stage?
I think often there are changes to the management of the farm, and one thing that farmers are looking at very carefully. The biggest cost of keeping a suckler cow is the winter, is the feed. And up here in Aberdeenshire, that can be 8 months long. And if that can be shortened by either totally outwintering or partially outwintering smaller cows that are hardy cows that will stand the cold, the frost, the wet, there's a massive cost advantage to many suckler producers. And I think a large number of people are now looking at how can they reduce the cost, this wintering cost for their suckler cows.
Let's look at cost more across the board, Chris, because it's a very important point. You know, that's a saving, that's great, but what is the cost of implementation of this across the full system?
Do you mean the cost of implementing inherit or?
Yeah, for sure. Just the changes of, you know, Bruce was running his farm like this. Now he's running it like this. What's the sort of cost roughly?
Well,
we don't need figures.
His cost saving could easily be £250 a cow, and Bruce is now outwintering the vast majority of his cows. I think he's only inwintering a few older cows and once calved heifers, and the rest of the herd is now outwintered. And that's quite a big ask, considering Bruce's location right up in the northeast of Scotland.
That's a phenomenal saving per animal. That's amazing.
It's a phenomenal saving. But if you think of the cost of not just feed, but the cost of bedding alone, you know, each cow requiring probably the better part of 2 tons of bedding per winter, that's a huge cost in itself.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And trying to sort of, I know this is ongoing, Lauren, and this isn't a thing that stopped yesterday. This is ongoing, and this will continue to be ongoing. But is there any sort of notable learning points that you've seen? Again, this podcast is primarily targeted at people that are maybe looking at joining a monitor farm program, or they're farmers themselves, maybe without that intention. But from a farmer perspective, is there any sort of key points that really jump out from this project?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that we learned from last year, and well, I'd say Bruce and the team as well, and we've changed that this year. So the two main learnings from the project last year was that Bruce decided to do his sampling last year by hair. And we have the option to do it with hair or tissue, and this year we've decided to do it with tissue samples. The reason for that is that we had a number of failures of his hair samples, which means that we weren't able to extract enough DNA to run the evaluation, and we find that we have a better and lower failure rate on the tissue, so we have a more likely chance of getting a hit, and that typically is around getting enough DNA. So as you can imagine, if you are taking a hair sample, you're pulling out the hair from the tail head, and where the DNA is in the hair bulbs. So it's not uncommon when people first start with hair sampling that we maybe don't get enough hair bulbs, or we kind of snap and we lose some of the actual bulbs and we get the hair but without the DNA. So that was a decision that was made this year. The tissue tagging is very straightforward for anyone that's familiar with a BDD tissue tag. Very similar process, takes a notch out of the ear and puts it in we use a specific tissue sampling unit that has preservative in it, and then that goes off to the lab, and that's yielded a higher number of results for us this year in terms of what was tested. So that will be one of the main learnings. The other thing is just making sure that the testing is done early enough. So we have to remember that we want to make a decision, but we have to plan towards that date when these heifers are going to be bred. So we need about 8 weeks turnaround time to be safe in terms of shipping. So all of our DNA is processed at our lab in America, and that means that it has to be shipped out there, processed, and results back. So it's just making sure that time is allowed. So we were a little bit tight last year for that by the time the animals ended up getting tested. So that's all been done further in advance this year, and that's meant that Bruce could make decisions about which animals he was keeping, but also sale decisions as well, which Chris could probably comment on as well, because that's been something that's been really where you've used the data this year as well. But that would be a big kind of watch out, is just, it's one of those jobs that sometimes can be put back a little bit because you're busy, and then before you know it, you've got a bit too tight to get everything turned around. So they would be the two kind of main takeaways that we've changed in terms of the process this year.
I did not know that hair was an option. That's how little I know about this topic.
Yeah, so most of it used to be done by hair, like most genomics originally, and I think some people would be familiar with that. But yeah, I would say the majority of what we process now through our lab is tissue, and it's just easier. It's easier to be sure that you have a sample, and as I say, the failure rate is lower.
Anything else you could add to that there, Chris? Anything you could add to?
Not really. I mean, I never liked the hair sampling system because, apart from what Lauren said, there were a number of samples that were contaminated with dung as well and had to be thrown. So I think the tissue sampling, I won't say it's producing 100% result, but it's probably 98% result. Certainly in Bruce's case, I think we had one that we had to retest.
Yeah, I think we had 5 last year, Chris, didn't we? So
yeah,
it's a big improvement.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And are those figures quite representative across the board when you've done this elsewhere? A much more success rate with tissue?
Yeah, I would say in general more success. I wouldn't have the exact fail rates off the top of my head on hair and tissue, but yeah, we would expect the majority of tissue samples to yield a result. There's multiple reasons why they don't. Often contamination. So again, if you the ear is covered in muck, for example, and you take a sample through that and there's lots of contamination, you'd be surprised how often we get little bits of tag in the sample because someone manages to go through the ear and the tag at the same time. And then also just storage. So if they leak, that's the biggest issue. So if the sample gets dried out while it's waiting to be sent or waiting to be processed, that's not uncommon. So either them getting too cold or too hot, being like left on a sunny window, for example, the pressure in the sample can sometimes mean that we lose some of the liquid because it evaporates, and then those samples can't be run. So yeah, there's the reasons why we don't always get a result, but the tissue is definitely the more reliable option and the preferred option for yielding a higher proportion of results, I would say. And it's more user friendly. You can look at it and be like, yeah, I definitely got tissue in that tissue sampling unit, whereas I think there is more human error with hair.
Chris, see looking at stabilisers as I almost want to say as a community, not the cattle themselves, the owners. Is it quite a close-knit community where farmers are worked together, or is it very much each farm operates on their own with in conjunction with America, wherever it is in America, or is there a bit of a community there?
No, I would say that is what is completely different to other breed societies, is that our multipliers all work together and they're all looking to improve what they're doing. And I mean, I think it's fairly well known that we import a number of embryos every year from the States, and that is our new genetics and different bloodlines. But farmers, there's an awful lot of interchange of knowledge between our multipliers. In the UK, we have somewhere about 90 multipliers, and round something about, well, each one, if you say each one's probably about 120 cows, do the math and you'll see how many registered cows there are in the UK. And that includes Northern Ireland as well.
And has that been on a constant increasing trajectory over the last 20 odd years? Or is that?
Well, it has been on a constant trajectory, and until now, I would say we're at quite a good number where we are at the moment. I'm not saying that will increase dramatically over the next few years, but I'm very comfortable with the number of multipliers that I have in Scotland, and some sell a lot more bulls than others. Some are concentrating on different traits. They're not all concentrating on one particular trait to improve. It's right across the board. But there's a lot, yes, you're right, there's a lot of communication between multipliers on a, I would say, daily, if not weekly basis, which is very different to a lot of other breed societies.
I like that. It feels, I don't know, it almost kind of feels like the way this monitor farm program works in a way. You know, there's people that are focusing on completely different things, whether that's an arable farm or like we have here, a farm with stabilisers, and they're coming together, doing a bit of knowledge sharing, not scared to say, well, this didn't work, you know, which is a big challenge in a lot of places, and also just try and work forward. And it sounds like the stabiliser world is like that, which I like to hear. One question that sort of I've almost been trying to work out how to ask it, so I'll just go for it and see if we can work it out. Both with a sort of with your vet head on, Lauren, and then sort of Chris with your sort of nutrition, beef and sheep, well, beef specialist side on. You've given some of the examples already of what these tests can do, what looking at genomic testing can do to work towards certain traits. What more can we done that we haven't covered, and maybe that we haven't actually started doing? Is there more to this, or are we sort of maximising what we can already do so far? I'll start with you, Lauren, because you're first on the screen again.
That's a tough question. Yeah, I think in terms of that breeding selection, then it really is that kind of pinnacle next step, I would say, in terms of the amount of data that's available for us, certainly on the females. I think if we were talking about kind of next steps and that genetic advancement and genetic progress, something that isn't being done at Sockentry but would be something that we'd start discussing elsewhere is the introduction of AI potentially. In typical systems when we're just running bulls, it's great, but if we're finding individual areas where we're maybe struggling on heifers or particular traits, then that is one way that we can bring in some different genetics into heifers, and that's, you know, something that we're seeing, and I'm sure you guys are seeing more on suckler farms now using AI technology. So that, again, access to push the genetics on without having to commit to a whole new bull can be another way that we can, I suppose, take this information even further and use it to do that in a way when we're maybe not ready yet for a new stock bull, or volume wise we don't have the capacity for multiples, but we identify areas that we need a bit of a push in some of the genetics there. So that will be one of the kind of potential next steps, that you could push this a little bit further in farms where that's an appropriate angle, I would say.
Yeah, what about yourself on your side, Chris?
Well, certainly one of the traits that we're working on very hard is net feed efficiency, which I think on Inherit is actually down as feed to gain. And we have done a lot of work before I joined, but also in the last 3 years in Scotland with bins and recording net feed efficiency with really astonishing results. And to say that there can be a pen of bulls with, on the face of it, on looks are all similar, but their net feed efficiency can vary by more than 100%. That is to say, the best performing bull will convert at just over 5 to 1, and the worst performing bull in the pen will be converting at 12 to 1. Now that, it's quite a heritable trait, feed efficiency or feed to gain, but it goes a little bit further than that, because it goes into conformation and fat retention in the animal as well, because net feed efficiency is not just about daily live weight gain, it's also a trait that we need to pass on to females because it makes them cheaper to winter. So in other words, they'll lay on more fat and therefore they require less feed in the winter. So we are, and this is ongoing, we have done 2 trials in the last 2 years in Scotland, and we are due to start another 2 trials, one in July and one in November, actually both in the Angus Glens.
That difference between 12 to 1, 5 to 1 is pretty phenomenal. That's almost scary that that's possible. I didn't realise that was the case at all.
Yeah, there's a very big fluctuation. Sorry, Lauren, go on.
No, I was just going to echo what you're saying there, Chris. I think that's you made a point there in terms of looking at them, you wouldn't expect that difference. And I think that's where this kind of genomic technology really comes in, because it's looking at the DNA and looking at the genetic differences in these animals to predict the impacts then that we're going to see in the phenotype and on that lifetime performance, and things like feed to gain, things like fertility. We can't look at an animal necessarily and see those differences, and that's where, you know, this adds on so much information for producers to be able to get that information on these animals and make selection choices through that alongside that traditional phenotype approach.
And I think that's a really good point to what was said earlier about, you know, that this isn't getting rid of looking at an animal. It's a combination of the two, and that's where it works hand in hand. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. That is. If someone's listening to this, because not everyone has stabilisers, if someone's listening to this and they have, let's not say a beef breed because I'll get in trouble for choosing one, a other suckler herd, is there opportunities for this for the extended beef sector, or are we not quite there yet?
Yeah, so Inherit Select is designed for commercial crossbreds at the heart of it. So the evaluation is heavily informed by Stabiliser genetics, because that's a big part of the data set behind it. But it does mean that we can look at a combination of 8 different breeds. So we have Angus's, Red Angus's, South Devons, Herefords, Simmentals, Gledvies, Limousins and Charolais all represented in the evaluation. So combinations of those, for example, if you had a herd that was heavily commercial Angus with some historic Limousin or continental genetics in there, then those animals would still be eligible. But it's something that we kind of discuss on a case-by-case basis. So if someone was interested and they thought that they have those kinds of genetics, then Stabiliser themselves as well, when we get in touch or inquire, we'll have a look and say, yeah, no, based on that we think you're going to get results that are going to be accurate enough to use, or vice versa. If we didn't feel like the representation of those breeds was going to be enough, then we would say not for now, because there's no point testing if we're not going to provide results with enough accuracy to make decisions.
You've either got a list in front of you, Lauren, or a really good memory for those breeds, because I would not have remembered them.
It's always the Gledvies that I forget, if I'm going to forget them.
See, they'd either be the one that I'd always remember because they're sort of slightly
unusual,
yeah, for sure. Yeah. Just as we draw this somewhat to a close, guys. Chris, if I was to ask, you know, again, let's sort of bring it back to the Monitor Farm programme. You guys have been working with Bruce. Is this a thing that continues, or do you get to a stage where you guys step back? Is this a thing that keeps on going?
No, I think very much we'd be really want to continue this, because I think having started the ball rolling, I think it's also, it's a bit of an aside, but it's also let Bruce select and sell a number of heifers for breeding off the farm, where he's probably got about a £400 premium over stall cattle price, because he had the data from Inherit Select.
Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, the prices in itself at the minute are fantastic. So to come out with that, you'll be quite a happy guy, I think, at the minute.
Yes, it was slightly surprising. I mean, when I had an inquiry for breeding heifers, and I said, I found you quite a nice selection of breeding heifers, and we have genomic data for them. And the farmer was very pleased to have that. It's a commercial farm. They're going to a commercial farm, but it does give him a starting point, and it also has maybe helped him, the farmer, with his bull selection as well.
Yeah, for sure. And if I was to leave someone maybe listening who's been quite interested in this, thinking, oh, I'd quite like to get involved, Lauren, if I was to ask you if there's someone out there that has a suckler herd, what do they have to do to get involved?
Yeah, so if someone thought it was going to suit them or they wanted more information, there is a genetics section on the Stabiliser website. So if you go to the Stabiliser UK website, there's a genomics section there, and you can input an inquiry. That someone will then get back to you and have a discussion on whether inherit's going to be something that's going to suit your herd. Like we said before, are the breeds suitable? And how's it going to work, and discuss that next step there. In terms of sampling itself, like we've touched on, it's done through tissue tagging. So once someone decides to go ahead, then they get the tags sent out, they're done, shipped back, and then the results, as we said before, would be discussed with them once the results are back, and that breeding strategy part set up. So yeah, I don't think we've touched on it yet already, but at the moment, we're looking about £31 a test. So in terms of that, for the genetic gain that we're hoping to get and identifying the difference, I think when we looked at Bruce's animals that we tested last year, we had some where we were seeing, a 60 to £70 difference in profitability between those animals. So that part of it is really expected on the ROI. And as Chris said, the changes to Bruce's breeding have then led to wider impact on farm in terms of the outwintering and stuff. So it's that whole picture that is what we want to look at, and absolutely want to keep this going and testing year on year, because as you can imagine, in the same way that investing in new genetics takes a little bit of time to come through, we want to track this through for Bruce and look at the monitoring of the performance of these animals going forward as well. So the sooner you start, the sooner you're going to start seeing differences and the impact from that different those changes in your selection.
In typical me fashion, I've said we're drawing this to a close.
Yeah.
Questions have sprung to mind. So you sort of touched on it there, Chris, almost about, it'll be interesting to see when sales begin happening from Bruce. But how long are we expecting? We keep saying Bruce. Let's say the farmer. Bruce has obviously been key in this, but how long are we expecting it to be before you start to see changes in their herd?
I think one of the things that we're starting to see in Bruce's herd already is much more uniformity in the cow herd. I remember Bruce's cows from maybe 10 years ago, and there were probably cows there weighing 550 kilos and cows weighing 900 kilos. And our target is to get an average cow size of around about 650, but with really good uniformity. So we don't want some at 550 and some at 850. Our target is, and bear in mind, there are still a lot of crossbred Stabiliser. His herd is by no means pure Stabiliser. We're breeding up every year, but we will be getting F4 Stabilisers calving down this year, so that's fourth generation Stabilisers. And they will, once they come into the herd themselves, once the heifers come into the herd themselves, they will be producing F5s or purebred calves. So 2 years from now, we should have F5 calves on the ground, and that should lead to a lot better uniformity.
And just so there's no confusion, because I actually think, I'm just trying to look back over the last 3/4 of an hour, I don't think we've actually said how long it is since Bruce started this project. I know you said, Chris, you had seen the cattle 10 years ago, but how long has this been happening at Bruce's farm?
I believe, Bruce has had Stabilisers on the farm for, I think, 7 years, but I would say for the first 2 or 3 years he was just buying another terminal sire. He wasn't really concentrating on the female traits. And I think one of the things that has really helped Bruce, being a monitor farm, is to get him to focus on the cows and produce the right type of cow for his land.
So those sort of notable changes have really happened in the last sort of half decade since they've been applied, yeah. And
yes,
and no, that's pretty impressive going, isn't it? Really, when you're sort of talking about that shift of almost 350 kilos, it's not shift, sorry, that variation, I should say, not shift. Lauren, how many tests are required to be done to sort of build up herd benchmark or a baseline for that herd itself?
So typically when we approach testing, we start with heifers, because that's where we have the most ability to influence selection. You've already invested in your cows, you've already kept them, they're already in the herd. So we're not going to make rapid changes there. So we'd normally start off testing heifers. On average, we'd normally say depending on numbers, obviously, and what's available, but in terms of getting the most benefit, we're saying, potentially deselect from those things we were talking before, late born heifers, things that aren't going to be big enough, poorer phenotype, and potentially you're looking at, say, deselecting about 25% of that heifer cohort, and then testing the rest. So of that remainder, on average, you're probably going to end up keeping about 50%, and that ability to pick the best 50 for your system is really where the benefit comes in. So if we have to be a little bit careful to pick and choose, so we want to still take that initial deselection, let's say, from what you're doing already, those ones that won't make the grade, but like we've said, we can't see these traits, so we want to make sure that of the ones we're thinking about meeting our standard for keeping, we want to test all of them and then pick the best from them. So year on year, the idea would be that you would test all of your potential heifers as that cohort, and then from that group we're then going to look at what strengths and weaknesses are and work on that year on year, and monitor the progress in those areas as well. So all of these results go into something called Search Point, which is our portal. So we've mentioned a couple of times a massive spreadsheet, which is the core of that result. But Search Point allows us to look at distribution of those results and kind of graphically look at things like progress on, we touched on mature cow weight just there, so things like progress on mature cow weight, and look at how that's changing on these heifers going forward. So you need a big enough set to do it on, but also you've got to start where you are. So if you're someone that only produces 50 heifers and then you're needing to keep 25, 30, that's what we've got. So you can still make progress out of that. The benefit comes from finding the ones that you would have otherwise kept that actually aren't going to suit your system, as well as animals that have superior genetics.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And a good note to end on for anyone who's maybe looking at doing it, whichever size your herd is. Lauren and Chris, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It's okay. Thank you.
Really good.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
No, thank you. It's been really interesting. I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of folk have enjoyed that and maybe getting in touch. And for those of you listening, that's been Lauren Porteus and Chris Barclay talking about the genomic tests that have been done at the Banff and Buchan Monitor Farm with Bruce. There's obviously much more episodes on this series and the podcast as a whole. If you haven't listened to any others, the first series we went through all the monitor farmers as part of the programme here in Scotland, and as I said just at the start, this sort of second series, if you will, is very much more focused on different projects and sort of technologies that are coming out of the programme itself. And just if this has been interesting to you and you have seen the rest already, which I hope you have, obviously, if not, go back and listen to them. But as ever, thank you very much for listening, and we shall see you for the next episode. See you then.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Monitor Farm Scotland podcast. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from for more episodes as we continue to dive into the stories from our monitor farms. If you want to stay updated with our latest news and events, please visit the Monitor Farm Scotland website and follow us on social media for more updates and keep in the know about what our farms are getting up to. Monitor Farm Scotland is funded by Scottish Government and managed by Quality Meat Scotland and AHDB.